Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. Have you ever done that thing where you play a take and you're really happy with it and then you realise that you'd forgotten to press record? I've just done that with this video, so I'm filming it for a second time. Anyway, in this video, I'd like to talk to you about 3 occasions where I believe that the phrase less is more is really applicable when it comes to mixing. So these are 3 areas where if you overdo these things, you might potentially compromise your mix a little bit. Before we get started, if you record music or you mix music, then I've got 3 free guides that I think you'll find really useful. I've got an EQ cheat sheet, a compression cheat sheet, and a vocal recording guide. And you can get all 3 by heading over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. Okay, so the first thing that I think that it's useful to keep in mind when you're mixing is how much compression you're using. Obviously, for most of us, compression is a really important part of mixing, and it's a really, really useful tool. But it is one of those elements of a mix where if you go too far with it, you can really make things sound very small and squashed, and you can sort of drain the life out of things by applying too much compression. Certainly when I listen back to any of the mixes that I did early on when I was first learning to mix, the thing that sort of strikes me the most is how much compression I was using. And not just how much compression, but how I wasn't using particularly optimal settings. So when you're using compression, it's important to keep in mind that you need to be intentional about the attack time, the release time, the ratio, the threshold. So what can happen is things can feel over-compressed if your attack time is too fast, for example, or things might be over-compressed because the ratio is too high or the threshold is too low. Now, obviously, no 2 signals are the same, and so what will work for one signal won't work for another. But these are some areas where if you're not intentional or mindful about how you have those things set, you run the risk of sort of applying a bit too much compression in your mixes. Now, how much compression is the right amount versus how much compression is too much compression is very subjective. It depends how you like music to sound. It also depends on what genre of music you make. So the amount of compression that you would generally hear in jazz music is very different to the amount of compression that you would probably hear in metal music. So there's no rights or wrongs necessarily. It's just an area of mixing to keep an eye on, because it is one of those things where compression can run away from you a little bit, and it's quite easy to over-compress your mixes. The next area where I think it's quite easy to overdo it, and an area where I think that less is often more, is reverb. Now, I love reverb, and I think that reverb can really, really enhance your mixes. But if you use too much, things can start to sound washed out, and you can reduce the clarity and the intelligibility of your mix. A couple of things to watch out for are your decay times being too long, and it's also useful to think about what type of reverb you're using. So something like a church or a hall reverb, it's probably going to have quite a long decay time. It's probably going to sound quite big and impressive, but does that work in the context of the mix? Perhaps you would be better using something smaller and more neutral, like a room reverb, for example. So reverb can sound great, but you do have to be intentional about how much reverb you're using. And the third area that I think it's useful to consider is panning. I know that a lot of people like to use what's referred to as LCR panning. So you would pan things either in the center, and then anything that's going to be panned away from the center would be panned either hard left or hard right. And I suppose the theory behind that is that that gives you the widest mix that you can have. Now, whilst that will give you a wide mix, I don't know that that approach is always necessarily optimal, because what can happen is you can end up with things in the center, or the hard left or the hard right, but you can kind of end up with a gap in between. And to me, that can sound a little bit unnatural. And I also think that approaching things in a way where you either pan things center, hard left or hard right means that you kind of miss out on the opportunity to have a slightly more intentional relationship between the instruments in the stereo field. If we think about drums, for example, what people will often do is they'll pan the overheads hard left and hard right. And that will certainly give you probably the widest drum kit sound that you could get. But what I really like to do with drums is actually bring things a little bit more closer to the center. And that allows me to kind of focus the drum kit around the center of the mix. It's not mono, it's just focused closer to the center. And then I kind of build outwards from there. So I'll then add the guitars a little bit further out than that. And I think that that gives you the opportunity to create a little bit more of a natural sound in the stereo field, rather than simply panning things out as far as they can go. And so I think if you do try and create the widest mix, you maybe lose the opportunity to do something a little bit more intentional and maybe a little bit more natural sounding. So those are 3 areas where I think it's really worth keeping this idea of less is more in mind when you're mixing. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that you start creating mono mixes with no compression and no reverb, but it's about finding the correct amount and being aware of the fact that if you go too far, you can potentially compromise your mix a little bit. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope it gives you something to think about. Don't forget to get that free EQ cheat sheet, that free compression cheat sheet, and that free vocal recording guide at mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.